Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to the spring edition of the Beth Tzedec Tzed Talk, which is now the third in our series of medical lectures that we've been putting on. I'll introduce myself. My name is Dr. Eddie Lang, and I'm a member of the board here, and I'm also the head of emergency medicine here in Calgary. So first and foremost, thank you for coming and welcome. It's great to see everybody here. I'll be your MC for the night, and we've got a great program lined up, and we're very excited to put this all together. I'll just give you a little bit of background. The Magen David Adom group met a few months ago and brainstorming about what we could do to promote Magen David Adom activities and the Tzed Talk, and it kind of dawned upon me that this week we have over 1,000 emergency physicians from all over Canada coming to Calgary for a conference through the Canadian Association of Emergency Physicians. And as you'll hear shortly, our guest speaker, Dr. Daniel Kolek, and who you'll hear more about in a moment, was our top choice for someone who would come and give the lectures. But our first order of events and our first speaker, just tell us about Magen David Adom activities. I'd like to present Mr. Sam Weiner, who has been doing a fantastic job with his wife Nava and the committee over the past few years, holding the flag and keeping support for Magen David Adom activities here in Calgary and doing a fantastic job. Very proud of their accomplishments. So I will invite Mr. Weiner up to the podium, who will do an introductory brief presentation about Magen David Adom before we introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Lang. Dr. Lang, Dr. Cohen, Fod Harav Ozachi, Orech Nichbad, Dr. Kolek, ladies and gentlemen. First, I want to thank Dr. Lang for organizing this Tzed Talk, and our appreciation, of course, to you, Rabbi Ozachi, and the Beth Tzedec Synagogue Organizing Committee for inviting Calgary Friends of Magen David Adom to be present at this most informative educational program. My thanks also to my co-chair, Dr. Jim Cohen, whose help and advice have been invaluable since the establishment of the Calgary chapter of Magen David Adom. My thanks as well to all members of the Calgary Friends of Magen David Adom Committee. On this 70th anniversary of Israel's independence, just recently celebrated, it is probably most appropriate to begin my remarks with a quotation from a letter written by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Magen David Adom a little while back. Quote, Magen David Adom is the largest and longest serving, life-saving organization in Israel. For decades, even prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, and of course since then, Magen David Adom teams have always been standing at the ready to provide assistance to any person injured or in a life-threatening situation. Magen David Adom provides its life-saving services to anyone in need, regardless of race, religion, or creed, in Israel and internationally. The Talmudic dictum, and now Magen David's dictum as well, holds true. Whoever saves a single soul is as though he has saved a whole world. And those affiliated with this organization should be credited with exactly this. As you can see on the map, the Israeli public is now 8.3 million people, Baruch Hashem, going about their lives in a small country that is all of 20,770 square kilometers. I thought about this. As an interesting comparison, the province of Alberta is 661,800 square kilometers, with a population of 4.3 million people. Imagine, it would take 32 states of Israel to equal our province's size and area. 1 second. Okay. Consistent with any world-class emergency medical service, MDA, Magen David Adom, makes extensive use of advanced life support treatment ambulances, you see in the corners here, medicycles and scooters, blood services, and helicopters. Magen David Adom also maintains a nationwide ambulance fleet of 900 life-saving vehicles, ambulances, and emergency scooters. The other point on this slide, which I'd like to emphasize, is that Magen David Adom uses its expertise and experience to assist many countries in crisis, search and rescue missions, tracing missing persons, and providing medical aid. The slide also indicates 1,850 employees. Today, by the way, it's close to 2,000 employees and 15,000 highly trained volunteers. Whoops. Sorry. Okay. Magen David Adom, pronounced MADA per its Hebrew acronym, is Israel's national emergency, medical disaster, ambulance, and blood bank service. The name in Hebrew means Red Shield of David. As mentioned, Magen David Adom, or I'll call it MDA from now on, was founded prior to the State of Israel in 1930 in Tel Aviv. The organization provides humanitarian and disaster relief services nationally and internationally. It has been a member of the International Federation of the Red Cross since 2006, working according to IFRC principles. Magen David Adom in Israel and worldwide saves lives worldwide. It uses its experience to assist many countries providing emergency medical services, blood products, and disaster relief. And you can see the various places worldwide where it has served. Now, MDA arrives on international assignments, and you can see some of most of the recent ones, equipped to deal with the unique nature of the emergency. I don't know if you're aware of the fact that Israel has become one of the leading countries in the world of high-tech innovation in health breakthrough technology. Much mobile cell and computer technology can be traced back to Israeli engineering. MDA makes full use of this portable technical advantage, both domestically and in its international assignments. This is the future National Blood Services Center, located near Tel Aviv. It is a state-of-the-art facility being built underground and above ground, fortified against rocket, chemical, and biological attack. It's being built to secure the blood supply both for domestic and international purposes. Nowhere in Israel is there immunity from rocket attack. The state has its share of both of wars and mass casualty terrorist attacks. The new National Blood Center is fortified against rocket, chemical, and biological attacks. Protection of the blood supply has now become even more crucially important, whether it is from wars, terrorism, or natural disasters. We know there will come a day when blood supply will play a critical role in saving thousands of lives. Beyond the thousands of lives blood saves in everyday medical emergencies such as surgeries or traffic accidents. No matter what the need is, the blood supply will be available for domestic and international purposes. Now, this is the National Public Cord Blood Bank. MDA has a few additional blood centers to serve the country. The largest one in Tel HaShomer in the Tel Aviv area, which houses a sophisticated national blood group reference library for rare blood. Now, MDA houses this National Public Cord Blood Bank, which supplies all of Israel's key medical and research institutions, and some sample beneficiaries appear on this slide. The MDA National Public Cord Blood Bank also supplies cord blood and stem cells internationally. And you can see the various countries that have received that largesse from Israel. USA and Canada also included. South America as well. Given Israel's unique, diverse population, it has the ability to supply rare blood units and stem cells, both domestically and to many countries worldwide. See all of them? These are all the gatherings of the exiles in Israel. 5,125 cord blood units from ethnic origins from 64 countries, 3 minorities, and 46 are sent at least around the world. We spoke about disasters. You see, seasonal shortages, nature-dependent disasters, hazardous materials, technology-dependent disasters, multiple casualty events, terrorism and war, conventional and non-conventional. Once again, here are the threats to the blood center for which the new blood center has been prepared. Rockets. The reality is there's no area in the country that is immune from rocket attack anymore. And of course, natural disasters, earthquakes, which are unfortunately a potential problem. Magen David Adom has chapters worldwide. Canadian Magen David Adom and its various chapters across the country are proud to contribute to MDA's life-saving endeavors. We have been doing our support work in Canada now for 40 years, greater than 40 years, and in Calgary now for greater than 10 years. We thank everyone who has helped MDA in this essential life-saving work for Tikkun Olam, for the benefit of Israel and the world at large. Toda Rabbah. Thank you so much.
Well, it's very clear how you, Mr. Sam Weiner, have been so passionate about this project and bring a fierce pride to your work with Magen David Adom. And I think we all really wish to thank you for all the hard work that you've done to keep the chapter going here.
Thank you so much, and Dr. Lang. I want to give credit also to my Director General, my wife Nava, who has spent hours also in this
For
assignment.
sure.
Yes, Doctor.
Just a quick, can you suggest ways that we can support MDA?
Well, we have information in the back. We have the Calgary chapter. And we, of course, they always require various types of equipment. So clearly, if we have a special assignment, a project for special equipment, it's an undertaking we would gladly deal with.
And we can have
That's right.
project together.
That's right. We have our phone numbers, and we have a brochure in the back that also has the various chapters and the phone numbers. Yeah, that's right. Jim.
It's also quite easy for those who want to donate. This is not a particularly fundraising event, but it's quite easy if you go to their website and just click, and you can do it electronically.
Fantastic. So Mr. Weiner's backgrounder, I think, is the perfect segue and introduction to our guest speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Kolek, coming to us from McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. He is an emergency physician in Burlington and has a number of very important roles in Canada and is recognized as one of Canada's top experts in disaster preparedness. He currently sits on the board of directors of the Center for Excellence in Emergency Preparedness, or CEEP. You might want to visit their website. There's lots of very good information there. And he chairs the Canadian Association of Emergency Physicians, the group that's meeting in town today, their disaster committee. He's an associate professor at the university, and I think if you ask any Emerge doc in Canada, who's the point person when it comes to preparing for a disaster, they will mention Dr. Daniel Kolek. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Kolek to the podium.
Now I have to live up to that, which is going to be difficult. It always looks so good. Let me just get this set up so I can give you the lecture. Perfect. All right. While we are setting this up, I will ask for some AV help, and I will start talking without it. You okay just getting it to display mode? Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Thank you. I was talking to Dr. Cohen earlier, and it reminded me of my connection to Magen David Adom. I went to high school in Israel, and as a teenager in Jerusalem, I volunteered on an ambulance. So I would spend a certain amount of time every week, a certain amount of shifts where we would just go out and respond to calls. And it was one of these things that was understood that the service was there. I'd sort of intuitively accepted Magen David Adom has always been there, and it's we didn't even think about it as the amount of work involved in setting that up. The other thing that was mentioned earlier, to talk about the ambulances with the intensive care and the cardiac care. I remember the first ambulance, the Shachal, Sharut Cholei Lev, there was a cardiology ambulance that came to Jerusalem with great fanfare. And that was having a cardiac monitor in an ambulance was a huge thing for us. And then I remember, again, about 45 years ago, if not, I'll figure out a way. I'll manage. About 45 years ago, I was walking in downtown Jerusalem, and there was a bombing. At Zion Square, some of you may remember this event, and I ran to the site because I was right nearby, and as the ambulances were coming in, we just did our stuff, and we didn't even think twice about it. And now, years later, as we had this conversation, I thought to myself, here I am 45 years later talking about disasters. This kind of stuff changes people. And the stuff that Magen David Adom did changed me as a physician, drove me to what I was doing. So they deserve a serious kol hakavod. It's been very formative and very supportive to a lot of people. I'll work with that. Okay. All right, so we're going to... Okay. All right, so I will step aside and I'll start talking. Okay. So I've been asked to talk about disaster preparedness in Canada. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide it into roughly 3 parts. The first part is to talk about what disasters are. What is a disaster? How is it defined? What is a disaster response? Okay. Then I'm going to talk about whether we are ready in Canada. And after that, I'm going to talk about what other countries do. And for that, I have some really cool pictures that I'm hopefully going to be able to show you. If not, I'll just tell you. So, a disaster is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as a sudden misfortune or an event that is damaging, which is intuitively we understand what that is, but that doesn't help you when you're thinking about a medical disaster. A medical disaster is a very specific beast. A medical disaster is when the event that's taking place has outstripped your ability to respond. And this is important because what is a disaster in rural Alberta is not a disaster in downtown Calgary. If you have so many resources and such demand, if you can match that, you're good. The moment the demand outstrips your resources, you have a disaster. Now, when you think of it that way, you realize that in your planning, you have to think of what's the event going to be. Now, I'm going to come back to that, but the balance is really, really important. And there are all kinds of disasters. We can talk about natural disasters, we can talk about technological, and I'll break them down in a moment. But one thing we have to think about is that disasters are common. Everybody thinks it's not going to happen here. And I remember when I chaired the disaster committee in a hospital that will remain nameless in southern Ontario, where I was the disaster committee. If I showed up and nobody else showed up, that was the meeting. Meetings went very quickly and decisions were made very easily. But that said, there was really no interest. Because everybody said, it's not going to happen here. But let me tell you, in the past 30 years, the amount of natural disasters that we have witnessed has quadrupled. Think back 30 years ago. How many times did you hear about the huge flooding? How many times did you hear about the wildfires? All the things that are happening naturally. They have gone up in numbers. In 1975, roughly 0.5 billion people were affected globally by natural disasters. In 2005, 2.3 billion people were affected by natural disasters. So huge numbers of people. Part of this is probably because we're getting better at reporting it, because we have media, we can reach out and so on. But a fourfold increase in natural disasters is a real thing. Whether it's global warming or not, I don't know. I make no claims to knowing enough about that. But I do know that it's happening more and more often. So the idea that it's not going to happen here does not hold. It's going to happen. The question is just when and what kind of disaster. In terms of the what, there really are three broad categories of disasters. There's the natural disasters, the acts of God, the earthquake, the fire, the flood, the epidemic, things that are outside of the control of anything we do. We can prepare for them, but these are things that happen in of themselves. Then there's the technological disasters. Show of hands, who has a cell phone on them here? Just raise your hand if you have a cell phone with you. Okay. 10 years ago, show of hands, who had a cell phone on them all the time? Hands aren't coming up. We're carrying this stuff with us all the time. We're more and more technology dependent. Case in point, my slides aren't projecting, right? We have to be able to work around that. But there's more and more things we use that can go wrong. Not only are there more and more things that we use that can go wrong, there are more and more things that are vulnerabilities. Because the one thing that every physician does when they walk into an emergency department, every single shift, bar none, they may not order this x-ray, they may not order this lab test, they will all log on to a computer network. Every single time, because that's how we get our data, right? And we saw what happened in England with the ransomware. We have a brand new vulnerability now that we all are dependent on computers. And I need to know that when I get data on a patient that this lab test says so-and-so, that it's real. And if somebody fiddles with that, they have control over my care. So the whole issue of technological dependence is a whole new set of disasters. Oh, brilliant. Now we'll see if I got it right. So that's the graph of the natural disasters, and that's the types of disasters. So we're dependent on technology a lot more than before. And by the way, this picture is the airplane. Note that there's another airplane on the runway. And in order to have that kind of timing, you have to have good computerized systems, right? And if the computer goes down at that moment in time, I don't want to be on either one of those airplanes. And then we get to the third kind of disaster, and that's the man-made, and that's the text that's cut off a bit at the bottom. But these are things that are done on purpose. And there is some overlap, of course. Ransomware is a man-made event. Tactical violence, events that are designed to harm you. For example, when someone sets off a bomb somewhere and the first responders arrive, what happens is you set off a second bomb and you take out the first responders, and you have now multiplied by far the impact of that event. Because in many cases, certainly recently in the States, the Orlando shooting and the Las Vegas shooting, almost everybody who got to hospital alive left alive. But they have to get to hospital alive. Right? So tactical violence is when it's planned. Someone is thinking this through and seeing what can we do in a way that will harm you. And that is nuanced a bit differently from the other kind of events. That said, whether it's a flood, whether it's a volcano, whether it's flying saucers from Mars, it doesn't really matter. Because ultimately, what we're looking at is the response. And the response actually is going to be reasonably similar because disasters have common characteristics. And I'm going to run through that for a second, and I'm going to come back to the idea of the common response. Disasters are scalable. Disasters can be local, disasters can be global, but they will have a finite size. Again, it's depending on resources. What will be a disaster for you in a certain area? There's a size to it. There's a scope to a disaster. And that becomes important. You'll see why in a moment. Disasters often have multiple patients. I say often because Ebola is rearing its ugly head again. Disasters can involve 1 or 2 patients sometimes and bring your hospital down if you cannot function because you have to isolate a certain part of the hospital. But typically, disasters involve large numbers of patients that are beyond your ability to cope. And the disaster can affect your function that way by either overwhelming your capacity to respond or by bringing down your capability. So remember what I said. If you have a demand that outstrips your supply, you have a disaster. If you have a supply that's driven down, you have the same disaster. You cannot cope with whatever's coming in. Okay? And the third thing that disasters can do is they can disrupt your function in terms of your supply chain. Because we live in an era of just-in-time supply. Anybody who's purchased something on Amazon and got it the next day is in awe of how quick this stuff moves, right? A lot of organizations have a system in place that when they need something, it's when it's going to be delivered. The problem is that this kind of just-in-time methodology doesn't work in disasters. Disasters are not a just-in-time world. Disasters are a just-in-case world. Hospitals need to be able to function for 72 hours on their own with no supplies because you don't know what's going to be outside that hospital at the moment the disaster hits, whatever the disaster may be. Now, disasters have timelines. Some disasters are called static disasters. It's a sudden event. This is a bus bombing in Jerusalem a few years back, or a bus rolling over, or a building collapse, or things that are something went boom, and you have a certain finite load of patients. If it's a bus, there's going to be roughly 45 people on a bus. That's going to be my patient load. If it's a coliseum, it's going to be a bigger patient load. But the limits of that load are understood. And what that means when I plan is I can distribute my patients, assuming I have a system that can allow me to do that, and I can plan around that. I know where the end is. The other side of that coin is when you have a dynamic timeline, and this is from the Quebec ice storm. Another example would be a pandemic. I know that when the summer comes, the ice storm will be over, for sure. But now I'm in the middle of it, and I have no idea when it's going to end. I know when I have a pandemic that it's going to end at some point, but I don't know when. The problem becomes, how do you plan for an event that you don't know the end of? And these are very different in terms of the types of disasters, though you'll see that the response still uses the same things. The static timeline will give you a whole lot of patients all at once, and primarily surgical patients. The dynamic timeline will be 1 patient, 2 patients, 5 patients, 20 patients, slowly building up. You just don't know when that one's going to end. Now, the events can be hugely different, but the response isn't. And this is where the second argument, first argument not to prepare for disasters where it's never going to happen here. The second argument that I would hear occasionally was, there's so many different things we have to prepare for. We can't prepare for all of them, so just let's not do anything. The thing is, it doesn't matter to me as the receiving physician if, I say this, it matters, but not in terms of my initial planning stages. Whether you came into me and you're a trauma because of a gunshot wound, or you're a trauma because you fell off a cliff. I still need to handle you as a trauma. Whatever the disaster is, the responses are going to be very similar. So remember I said it can be variable, but the response is always local. The disaster is what is in front of you right now. Something that's happening across the world may be a disaster, but you do not have to respond to it. At least not immediately. Your disaster, your response is always going to be local. The disaster, oh my goodness, I'm doing something odd here. The disaster may overwhelm your resources. It may damage your facility. It may disrupt your supply chain. Doesn't matter, because ultimately you're always going to need 4 things. And if you get those 4 things, you're golden. And those 4 things are staff, space, stuff, and a system to deliver it. And that is true whatever disaster. I challenge you to find an event that does not need these 4 components. They may be different staff, maybe different spaces, but you need those 4 things. And if you can plan around that, then you can handle anything, because you can nuance it to respond to whatever the event is, as long as you know where to get these 4 things. So, staff. Your first question is, who is involved? And when you look at that, you have to think, not who are the people. I don't need Joe and Sam and Moshe and whatever here. What I need to know is, what are the jobs that are going to be filled? What are the tasks that are filled by your nurses, by your other professional staff? What are they doing? In a disaster, I need someone to do X. I don't care who it is. Ideally, you want someone doing what they're used to doing, because they'll be better at it, they'll be smoother at it. I wouldn't expect the registration clerk to be directing traffic. It's not what they're usually trained for. I want to use their skills the best I can. But you have to think task more than person. The other thing is, you have to wonder, who's going to be involved? Because if you have a 2-car crash in suburban Calgary, it's going to involve ambulance, it's going to involve police, it may involve fire, but that's pretty much it. But if you have a shooting at an embassy in Ottawa, you have a whole load more players now. So think of the event, think of who might be involved, who you might have to deal with. And the classic example of the entity that is underestimated and that is going to be in your face is media. In Orlando, again, Orlando and the Vegas shooting are in the forefront of my consciousness, because I just 2 weeks ago spoke to some docs who were involved in that. And they were totally overwhelmed with media, despite the fact that they had a police barricade around the hospitals, despite the fact that they had press briefings, people were still coming in. And in today's world, anybody with a cell phone is the media. So that's one thing to think about. Who else might you have to deal with? So that's in terms of staff. Oops, stuff. Did I go back? Let me just go back one slide. So the stuff is, how do we know what we need? Okay, because we will need different things for different situations. And in order to do that, we have to have a plan. Oops. Never mind, I will fix that. Disaster response requires, at the very first step, a risk assessment. You have to figure out, what are you at risk of? And I will tell you, you do this at home every single day. In this country, in this city, I can guarantee you that in your home there is a snow shovel. Why? Because you know that you are at risk of snow, and you have a plan, which is shovel the snow out of the way, or get someone to do it, but you've made a plan around that, right? You do your risk assessment, and you figure out what it is that is going to affect me. And to do that, you have to figure, is it probable, and is it going to have an impact? So, for example, a pandemic, probable, would have an impact. I have to have a plan. The return of Elvis Presley, not probable, and even if it happens anywhere outside of Graceland, you don't care. So, not important. So you go through your risks, you figure out what is important, and you develop plans for that. And from that plan will come the list of stuff you need, because you know what you're going to be doing. So you have a plan. What about space? I'm going to talk about that a bit more in a moment. But with space, there really are 2 options. You can either increase the supply, and that's the part I'm going to talk about some more, or you can decrease the demand. And to decrease the demand, you start degrading your services. Some things you don't offer in a disaster. Some things you offer but don't do it to the standard of care that would be normally accepted. For example, you take someone to the operating room, you have another 20 people who need that operating room, you do not do definitive surgery. You'll do salvage surgery, you keep them alive so you can bring them back later and bring the next person in. So you maximize your beds, your space, by using each bed for a shorter duration. And the other option is to start treating in non-conventional areas. I will give you some examples of that. I'll have some pictures of that. Finally, system. We are really brilliant as human beings at creating complex systems. You know what happens when something untoward happens in an organization. A committee is formed. The committee nominates a task force. The task force, this moves on, and you have a hugely complex system. In a disaster, you can't afford that. You need to have a system that is very, very straightforward. People have to know exactly what they're doing. It has to be robust enough to adapt to the nuances of that disaster. So you want to go from something as complicated as that to something more like that, right? And you want to have the same system everywhere because, and everywhere I mean across the country, because if I am at hospital X and I need something for another hospital, I need to be able to contact my opposite number and say, you are doing my job over there, and I need this. I need to be able to make that as a single connection, not have to search for people. This kind of system exists. It's called, in this country, it's called the Incident Management System. In the States, it's called Incident Command System. We're Canadians, we don't like the term command. We've changed it to management. And it is, in theory, what all hospitals are supposed to be doing. The problem is that some hospitals are using incident management system, but they're using their own incident management system. They've created something different, and they've just used the same label. So we do have a problem, and I'm beginning to sort of drift into what the Canadian picture is, that there are some hospitals that have a different management structure, and when we need to give mutual aid, we're going to have a communication issue. Now, as I said, I'm going to talk about our Canadian hospitals ready. Well, if you in 2011 Googled Emergency Department Disaster Readiness in Canada, you would find two articles, two people, twice that has been looked at. And if you looked at those articles, they're both from the same authors. I was one of those authors, disclaimer. And they looked at disaster preparedness in 2008 and repeated that in 2011. Now, let me remind you that in 2001, 9/11 happened. You would think that somewhere across the board in this country, some government official would have said, let's check if our hospitals can handle this. And the reality is, no. There has been no government assessment of our readiness. But let's see, time moves on. 2014, Google algorithm is such that sometimes things will drop off. We only find one of those articles quoted and a CBC article about the same, but there's nothing new. I did the search again a few days ago and I discovered there was one other article. So basically, going back to 2008 to now, there have been 3 published articles that looked at Canadian disaster readiness. And I'm going to go through them a little bit so you get some idea of what they say. And there's been nothing at the federal or provincial levels that looked, there's no scorecard that the hospitals were held up to. So if you ask me, are hospitals ready? I'll give you my answer in a minute. Let me keep the tension up a little bit. Okay. So this was the study that was repeated in 2008, 2011. Sorry, 2001, 2008, I apologize. 2001, immediately post 9/11, and 2008. So right after 9/11, it was the December of that year, I surveyed all the emergency departments I could access. It was mailed out to all emergency departments, not everybody responds. And I asked them some really basic questions. And remember the environment. Think back to what the mood was like post 9/11. And I asked them, have you looked at your disaster plan within the past 3 years? And 81% said yes. Now, if I was, and I was an emergency physician, right, I have to ask myself, I'm a glass half empty kind of person, who are the 1 out of 5 hospitals that didn't even bother to look at their disaster plan post 9/11? Move up to 2008, the picture hasn't changed. There's still 20% of hospitals in this country who have not even looked at their disaster plan, let alone tested it. Okay? 40% in 2001 had some sort of a paper trial to check if their disaster plan would work. It got a bit better in 2008, numbers better 65, and they did a tabletop exercise. If you look at exercises, and I'm going to come back to that because exercises are the ultimate litmus test. In 2001, at that point, only 4% had done an exercise in the past 3 years. All right, fair enough. 9/11 was a wake-up. This is right after 9/11. They haven't had time to do that. Come back in 2008, you only have 30% who've done an exercise. They've had 7 years post one of the largest terror events, certainly a large terror event on this continent, to make you think about maybe are you ready for the same kind of thing. I'm going to point out one other thing. Protocol for bio events. We asked the departments, if you are faced with an event that requires reporting, let us say you come across a case of anthrax, a case of, heaven forbid, smallpox. Now, that's something you don't want to hide in your department. You want to share with other people so they know this is happening. you need to know how to call public health. So in 2001, when asked about the protocol for bio-events, 37% knew how to call their public health officer. This is a zero-cost item. This is not something that costs the hospital money to have. They have to just have thought ahead of time, what do I need to prepare for? So the argument that we are not ready because it's too expensive to prepare does not hold here. And in 2008, that number suddenly skyrockets to 88%. Anyone have any idea why? What happened between 2001 and 2008? SARS. After SARS, everybody's public health officer was their best friend because they needed to know who to call because we were scared. And even then, after SARS, it still is only 88%. So this gives you an idea of sort of the kind of data we're finding across the country. The other study, as I said, was done by the Trauma Association of Canada. And what they did is they looked at trauma centers. And remember I talked about the static event where you're going to have a whole bunch of people all at once, like a building collapse? Those are going to be primarily surgical patients. They're going to need to have some access to trauma-capable centers. So they looked at 5 provinces, 23 trauma centers responded, 83% had a disaster committee. Now, the hospitals are mandated to be ready for disaster. The fact that there are 17% that don't even have a committee is worrisome in of itself. Of those committees, roughly half didn't involve the trauma person, which means that they're making plans in the absence of the person who's actually going to be doing the work, which is not a good arrangement. Half the institutions have not run a disaster drill in the past 2 years. 70% didn't have, had communication assets that were designed to go through mass casualty incidents. If you all try and take your phone out and dial and get a line at the same time with your cell phones, you're not going to get it. There's only a certain capacity to the network. So you have to have some way of communicating around that. And more than half the trauma directors did not know if their facility was able to sustain itself for 72 hours. Maybe it was, but the fact they didn't know means they're disconnected. They're not part of the planning. So, are hospitals ready? What I can tell you with certainty is there has been no standardized assessment ever done, and these tools exist. It's not that they have to develop a way to test hospitals. There are ways to test hospitals. Okay, so not been done. There's no standard of care. So, if you think about it, if you walk into the emergency department with chest pain, there's a standard of care. If you walk in with an extremity injury, there's a standard of care. If you walk in with a child with fever, there's a standard of care. A disaster is the only disease entity that has no standard of care. And disasters are ultimately diseases. They cause morbidity, they cause mortality. But we have not deployed any standard in this country to see if hospitals are ready. And yet these standards exist. And there's no federal provincial insistence on readiness. There's statements to the fact. But south of the border, if you do not certify under JACO, which is the American Accreditation Organization, as being disaster ready, you lose funding. This has teeth. You lose part of your Medicare funding. So that is a big deal. Here we have something called accreditation, which is voluntary. And they basically say, do you have a disaster plan? Yes. Did you look at it? Yes. Check, you're good. So there's really no assessment. So the answer to the question, are hospitals ready here? I can't prove no, but my gut and the limited information I do have tells me that there are big gaps in readiness with centers of excellence. Some places are really good, but there are serious gaps in readiness. So let's look at what it looks like. What do Israeli hospitals do, and American hospitals and French hospitals, each with their own nuance, and British hospitals? They all have this already, they've thought this through. First of all, like I said, they have a plan. And they've tested their plan. So if plan A doesn't work, use plan B. Plan B doesn't work, use plan C. But check it. Make sure you have a plan that'll work. Make sure everybody involved is in that plan. And by the way, if you bring everybody together to make the plan, you're already breaking down the silos of care. That's already a beginning of getting more efficient because you're all talking around the same table and you're all talking the same language. For time. I'm mindful of the time. I promised Eddie I wouldn't go too long. But I will tell you an anecdote apropos talking the same language. Post 9/11, there were some anthrax envelopes mailed out to American congressmen. And so at one point, the FBI said, we've got to do something about this. Who's the expert on anthrax? Well, it's the Centers for Disease Control. So the FBI and the CDC sit down together to work out some sort of plan to deal with these anthrax attacks. It took half a day for them to realize that when they say surveillance, they're not talking about the same thing. Right? They spent half a day till they realized that the FBI surveillance is standing across the street with binoculars. The CDC surveillance is checking who's infected. Right? So you have to have that common language, and to do that you have to plan together. So that's where the plan part comes in. One of the joys of this talk, by the way, is I have to try and make Armageddon entertaining. So I know this is depressing, but really we're not all going to die tomorrow, I promise you. When you have a plan, you have to train your staff. You have to practice. If you have not practiced, you will not know what works. And you want to have exercises, and you want to have exercises that fail. You want failure in your exercises. And let me give you an example. Here's a team that is preparing to decontaminate people. It's a contaminated event. Anyone spot the error? They got their gas masks on. There are no gloves. Now, this is a slide that was given to me, and apparently it was from an American exercise, and I'm sure that it's gone a bit viral in the disaster community. I'm sure that these folks will never do it again. Those of you who remember the Entebbe Raid many, many years ago, the airport in Entebbe was a duplicate of the airport at Maalot. The airport at Entebbe was built by Israeli contractors, and they practiced, and the first drills that they did were terrible. The outcome was going to be terrible. And at one point, the government was saying, we should drop this. And Matan Vilnai, who was at the time, he ended up being my commander in officers course, turned around to him and says, you want those failures. You want to keep on having those failures because you won't do it twice, right? So you really do want, don't be discouraged if your exercise is bad. You want it to be bad. If you have a perfect exercise, you've learned absolutely nothing. Now, what else do? They flow their patients. They recognize they're going to have a lot of people coming in at once. They don't want to have people standing there directing you to here and you to here. They make it really clear where you have to go. So, for example, this is in Tel Aviv at one of the hospitals, in the staff parking lot, because you know that if you have to clear a parking lot, the staff are all in the building, they can move their vehicles. And they just basically painted and says, Knisa, entrance, and the directions one way. You come in one way, no one doubles back, you go straight through treatment and out. Okay? So that's one solution. You don't want to paint it on the ground? Youre Tzedec in Jerusalem does it differently. They have a room of signs, and there's not many, 10, 12 signs, and there's a map, and sign A goes on spot A. It takes them 10, 15 minutes to deploy that, and that's how they do it. But they make it very clear where you have to go. They also make it very clear who's who. And again, not based on your name, but what are you doing at that moment in time? What is your role? So these vests, for example, this one says Rofeh, physician. There are ones that say nurse. There are color-coded ones. And you'll see more of them in the slides coming up. But they make it very, very clear. So that part of the communication is taken care of already. Don't waste time. You want to have things really obvious. They think about working in the dark and in noise. People are talkative. People who are stressed are more talkative. Then when there's a crowd, what happens when there's a crowd, you want to talk to the person next to you? You talk louder, so the whole thing gets loud. So at Youre Tzedec, they set up a public address system in the area, which would be the patient drop-off. Other hospitals basically have megaphones locked in a cupboard because you have to lock it up. Things move. Hospitals are miraculous that way. Inanimate objects suddenly acquire life and leave, so you have to have the stuff locked up. But whatever you do, think of how you're going to solve the problem. Think of how you want to work in the nights so that you're able to extend your lighting or have lights you can bring out, whatever. Have a solution. Just think about it ahead of time. It doesn't have to be expensive. They use non-conventional treatment areas, and I said I was going to come back to that. You see a hallway. They see a potential ward, and what they've done is, in fact, they plumbed into the hallway oxygen and compressed air and power points so that they can take Ward X, if you know you're going to get a whole lot of patients coming in, Ward X knows that hallway Y is where I'm going to decant 3, 5, whatever number of patients, and I'm going to send one nurse with those patients. And the new patients come right into the ward. Why? Because the patients who we have already with us, we know what their problems are. We can sort of guess who is the safest at a lower level of care, and we move them to the ward. Other ways, the Russians have set up systems where they will treat people, if it's a large event, in their subway system. Those of you who've been to Moscow, the subway system is glorious. It's museum quality glorious with chandeliers. Well, they have a plan. Certain hospitals will deploy and create another treatment center in a non-conventional area in the subway. Doesn't matter where, your cafeteria. This auditorium can house a whole load of walking wounded. You just have to think out of the box a little bit. They standardize their processes. By the way, notice the vests again. You know exactly who's who. When patients come to the hospitals, you're going to divide them into 4 categories, broadly speaking, 4.5. And each of those categories gets the same standard routine care, at least initially. You don't start doing personalized care, you're doing mass production here. So those 4 categories are the ambulatory, what we call in my department the walkie-talkies. If you can walk and you can talk, you're not that sick. You can walk and you can talk to somewhere place away. And that'll be an area like this. It can be, again, a cafeteria, a lobby, whatever. The non-ambulatory, you're sicker now. For whatever reason, you cannot move yourself. We have to put you somewhere where we can care for you, and you will require a different kind of care. So, for example, anybody in the non-ambulatory area will be taken to whatever ward it is. Everybody coming in gets the same blood work, gets the same IV started. Everything is done automatically. We draw all the tests, order relevant x-rays. All that stuff is automated. You don't have to get the physician to come by and order the stuff. You plan it ahead of time. You will do this in a mass casualty event. Everybody gets the same. And then if we're over-investigating, all right, so we are. But at least that way you get the first group of people through, and you can start personalizing the care later on. Resuscitation, that is the only personalized care. People who are truly going to die immediately and that are still deemed salvageable, they will be treated as per whatever their problem is. And the morgue. The morgue, by the way, does not have to be on site. We have hospital morgues, but if you're going to have a mass casualty event, you may not want to have transportation coming in and out of your hospital. You may want to clear that, move the morgue somewhere else, at least in a temporary fashion. The Canadian lore is that it'll always be the local hockey rink because you can put things on ice. This is what I'm told. I have yet to see a city that has put that in their plan, but that is sort of the stuff of legend. Now, I should point out that we put these in color categories. So the ambulatories are green, the non-ambulatories are yellow, the resuscitations are red, and the morgues are black. The same color codes are used by ambulances, but for different reasons. Ambulance triage is in the field to decide who's going to be taken away first, who do I have to get out of here fast, and who can wait till the next round of ambulances. And they also use the same color category. Why am I mentioning that? The first patients to come to you are going to be the ambulatory patients, the least sick patients, because they can get there on their own power. If I took a smoke grenade and threw it here on the carpet, I can guarantee that none of you are going to wait for an ambulance before you move in the general direction of out the door. Right? You're not going to wait. You're going to go. In the Tokyo sarin disaster, 608 people, I think, registered or arrived at the hospital in 90 minutes. Of those, 500 came independent of EMS, independent of ambulance. The horde of locusts is going to descend upon your hospital, consuming all your healthcare resources. You need to divert them away somewhere else. Do not bring them into your emergency department. Put them somewhere else so that you can keep that, because the sicker patients are coming, they're coming later. Now, I mentioned 600 people showing up. It was St. Luke's in Tokyo. Imagine trying to register 600 people. Just the thought of sitting down and putting the names down would take forever. So what people do is they have pre-printed charts with what the Israelis call iron numbers. And this is an old slide. The chart happens to be in a binder, but the concept holds. The chart is printed. It's in the computer system ahead of time. There is a patient who's called A001 and A002. They made 100 charts. They're sitting there. When you arrive, you get an armband on you that says you are now patient A001. Your chart is ready. Your X-ray requisitions, if you need it, your lab requisitions, the stickers for the blood work, all this stuff is pre-printed and ready. It doesn't take up a lot of space. And you can later on, the clerical staff catches up and says, oh, patient A001 is Frank Smith. And you can marry that up. But at the very beginning, I need to move people through. Let's not stop for paperwork. Let's generate those patients ahead of time, and let's just put those labels on people. Under the heading of standardization, they also pre-stock standard trays. So you know you'll be doing certain procedures. You'll be doing intubations, which is putting a tube down to the lungs. You may be doing starting IVs, whatever. They've set up trays that they will put at whatever their treatment areas are. They are all, the colors are different, but they're all exactly the same. So when I'm reaching for something, I know exactly where it is. And we do that for a lot of procedures already in the operating room because it's efficient. But they've done it for their disaster deployments so that when they need to invoke the plan and the nurse knows my job is going to be to go to that area, receive the patient, start an IV, my IV needles are here. They don't have to reinvent it. You do not want to waste time running around looking for stuff. Now, the other thing that we didn't talk about, I do want to mention, is decontamination. Israel lived under the threat of of gas attacks. We've all heard about this. At one point, they distributed gas masks to all the population. But it doesn't have to be malicious. People are far more stupid than they are malicious. And errors happen a lot more often than acts of war. You can have toxic exposures, and we've all seen spills, and I don't know who remembers the Mississauga train derailment, where Mississauga was evacuated, right? So the odds of a contaminated event are not tied into war. You have to be able to decontaminate patients. You have to be able to decontaminate them outside of your department. You don't want to bring a contaminated patient in, because if you do, you risk your department going down. In the Tokyo Sarin event, again, patients initially they didn't know what they were dealing with, and patients came in and their clothes were thrown in the corner and the clothes were off-gassing, so staff was beginning to get ill. So you want to decontaminate outside. Israel has more clement weather than we do, so they actually do it outside. They've got, this is not fully set up, privacy is maintained where possible, but in our environment, we typically would plan to do this in an ambulance bay, where you can shut the doors off and you can just wash things down. You need to have two streams for your decontamination. First, for the majority of people who are ambulatory, they can decontaminate themselves. Taking your clothes off is already 80 to 90% of your decontamination, because almost everything's on your clothes, typically. And then if you shower off, you get rid of the rest of it. That obviously doesn't include stuff you may have ingested, but anything on your surface you can get rid of reasonably quickly that way. The other group is the non-ambulatory. And here's where practice comes in. Again, an old slide, but I love it because it really makes the example clear. When you're wearing this kind, anyone here worn a gas mask? Yeah, so a few of you. You remember that it's really not easy to communicate when you have this thing on board, even with the more modern gas masks, let alone the fact that you're steaming up and you're not seeing well. But when you talk, that's the kind of communication you're going to have. In an event where you have to work as a team, you have to plan this ahead of time. You have to know what you're doing, right? You have to practice it, and that's where the drills become really important. And here, just to point out a nuance, instead of using a vest because they're wearing all that PPE, they wore a sash. Same idea, though. They're identifying who they are in the system. What else do the Israelis do? They consider their population. Youre Tzedec in Jerusalem, they have an Orthodox population. Gas masks don't fit on a beard. So they have gas masks that are designed to create more pressure within the mask and have flow going out, designed for people with beards. Why? Because they did a risk assessment. They know what their population is. You need to know how many kids there are in your environment, because if you're a small child, that child isn't going to wear a gas mask. That child's going to be in a little tent in their crib. So how many tents do you need? In Kingston, Ontario, there's a public health officer who was, prior to that, an emergency physician by the name of Kieran Moore. And he's a bit of a computer fanatic. And what he did is he actually managed to put together data through computer mapping of Kingston. And he can tell you exactly where certain languages are spoken predominantly in town, what the level of income is for a certain neighborhood. All the kind of stuff that you wouldn't think of intuitively as a medical issue. But if you have to evacuate the city, you want to know who doesn't own a car, because that's where you're sending your buses, right? So he's done that kind of work. So stuff like this is happening. There, like I said, there are centers of excellence, and that's one of the bright lights. This kind of information exists, and we can share it across the country. I'm getting towards the end. The other thing they do is they consider their staff. Now, most of us in healthcare we want to help. That's why we got into this business. It's not that it's this very dramatic altruistic thing. It's just in our nature that we want to help people. There are, however, 3 reasons that healthcare workers will not show up when you call. Number 1 is their kids. If they cannot be assured that their kids are safe or taken care of, they're not coming. And I understand that. Number two is their parents. We live with elderly parents, or we have elderly parents that we're responsible for. We need to make sure they're safe. Anyone can guess what number three is? Their pets. There was a study done by David Cohn by now, probably about 15, 20 years ago. But if you have no place to put Fifi the poodle, you're not leaving Fifi the poodle as the gas cloud is approaching. Right? So those were the three things. So Rambam Hospital set up a daycare for their staff. As part of their disaster plan, they have that set up. I don't know if they have a routine daycare as well, but that is part of their plan. And finally, this is really cool, and I just ran across this the other day, so I can't give you a lot of information, but I thought this was brilliant. They think out of the box. These are medical clowns. Now, there is a medical clowning program in Israel. When I had family that was ill at Youre Tzedec Hospital, I was there and encountered medical clowns. And it is really quite amazing how they can change the mood in a room. And these are not people who are showing up and, cracking inappropriate jokes. They're very appropriate, and they're very aware of how to function in a medical environment. And at Rambam Hospital, apparently, their disaster plan involves the medical clowns. They said, if there's a disaster, what do? Well, they figured it out. They found some role for them to play. So think out of the box. Who do you have? Who are the resources around you that you can call on that might bring something to the table you didn't even think about? Disaster response is the ultimate medical team sport. You can never do it alone. You have to bring as many people under the tent as possible, and then eventually you'll figure out a way to get everybody involved. So, I've been talking for a while. Let me summarize out. Disasters are frequent. It's not an if, it's a when. Something is going to happen that's going to outstrip your resources. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be, the collapse of a building, but something's going to happen that's going to outstrip your resources. Whatever the event, the response is predictable. You need space, you need stuff, you need staff, you need system. So create that ahead of time, because you can use that. I have a friend, by the way, who organized his daughter's wedding using the incident management system, because he figured out it's all the same stuff. It's any problem you have to solve, you'll need the same things. Right? We cannot say that Canada is ready because we haven't looked. So my gut tells me that there are serious gaps, but I cannot say that with any degree. I come from McMaster. McMaster is where evidence-based medicine is king. And when you say good morning to someone, the response to that is, what is your evidence for that? Right? So I can't say with good evidence that we're not ready, but the evidence that's there makes me worry. Other countries have mandated and enforced health readiness. They made a point of it, they put it in legislation, and they've enforced it, which means hospitals are ready because they have no choice. And there's nothing in our environment that's blocking us. Because if we want to, and if we get the drive, we too can become sort of the masters of disaster. All righty. And I'm going to stop with that and open myself up to questions from people. Any questions, or have I totally terrified you? Yeah.
The hospital you work at, do you have a regular disaster exercise?
No. The hospital I work at, I volunteered my services to the disaster committee, and it wasn't even declined, it was never followed up on. Because I have to tell you, and you're in the medical world, you know that an expert is someone from far away, right? If you're local, it's just Colic. He works in the Emerge. What does he know? But no, there is a disaster committee. They are, and I said that a bit flippantly. I am trying to drive them a bit nuts by pushing, but there's things we need to do. But we certainly haven't had exercises. And yet we've had a train derailment. It's not like things don't happen. We've had a train derailment within the past 2 years. So, and we've had a major fire at a hospital, and another hospital had to be evacuated. We had to intake the patients. So it's not, and we did reasonably well, all things considering. But the truth is that every disaster will end. You will muddle through every disaster, and somehow you'll come out the other end because time doesn't stop. The question is, could you have done better? Could you have cut down on your morbidity or mortality? There we go. Okay. Other questions? Yes?
What should an individual do to prepare?
You mean for yourself? Okay. There are all kinds of really good resources online. I think CDC has some good stuff as well. But you should really plan on what do you need in your home for 72 hours? Because that seems to be the magic number that everyone's quoting. I don't know where that number comes from, but it is the number that seems to be the industry standard, which includes water, which includes food, which includes alternate power. So, for example, do you have battery packs for your cell phone or whatever? Do you have medication? Don't wait till your medications run out before you reorder. That's one part of it. The other thing is if you have to evacuate, that's the stay-in-place plan. The other part is if you have to evacuate, do you have a go bag? Basically, what is it, or at least have you done it in your head, what is it that you know you're going to have to grab? Are you going to have to grab your passport? Do you have money? Do you have, again, medication? Do you want to grab your iPad because that's where all your family's data is? Whatever. Think the process through. Where we fall apart is not on the capability, it's on the thought. So think of two plans. What do you need to stay at home for 72 hours? And there are all kinds of resources online. And the other thing is, think of if you have to move, what do you take with you? Those are, and once you think about that, it'll become obvious to you what you have to prepare. Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you, first of all, for coming. That's very thought-provoking.
Oh, you're welcome.
I'm a paramedic here in the city. And I'm wondering if you could just spend a couple minutes talking about EMS, disaster preparedness, your experience and thoughts.
I don't have hard data. I'll tell you, my experience is that EMS is far more flexible and disaster ready than the hospitals because you are used to going out into what is truly an unknown. For me, the unknown comes in through the door, but I somehow can filter it in certain categories. You go into the void and you have really no idea what you're going to face. So typically EMS seems to be ready to respond to most things, at least at the individual crew level. Now, whether the overall system is organized to do that, I don't know. The Manchester bombing recently, they had, I think it was 18 or 20 ambulances at site within minutes. I have no idea where a city like Manchester gets 20 ambulances, but I'm struck by the fact they got them all there that fast, which means that they have an EOC, a dispatch center that can function and can flip into disaster mode reasonably quickly. So I don't know whether EMS is ready. I know that we are having more and more exercises that involve EMS and hospitals because often there was sort of a communication gap. And so we're trying to more and more have exercises where the EMS crew brings people in and the hospital does the receiving, and we try and work on that interface. What else about EMS? Different jurisdictions have different processes. Montreal EMS, for example, has set up a whole system where they can decontaminate people using city buses, where you get onto the bus, you get decontaminated, come off the bus, go onto another bus, you get your clothing, and so on. So they have a system put in place. So they're thinking ahead, and that's innovative, that's local. I don't know if that's shared anywhere. I do know that amongst the physicians who are disaster-friendly, a large number of them were involved in EMS beforehand. And there are members of NAEMSP, and they have training as paramedics. So there is a certain natural connection. But I cannot tell you, I have no hard data. Similarly, no one has tested EMS. There are more, EMS is involved in more disaster responses than hospitals are. Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
Have you made any, when you guys make your plan for preparing for a follow-up attack in the event of a terrorist, and what comes to mind is San Bernardino, when they ran their active, before that shooting took place, actually the very day before, they ran an active shooter training program that the assailant took part in. And then, so he was prepared for, he knew where everybody was going to be, where everything was going to be. And then as well, he prepared improvised explosive devices for when the police initiated their pursuit. In the plans you've seen, has anyone made a plan for, okay, so everyone knows, okay, this event happens, let's say it's a terrorist attack, they're going to go to the mass casualty center. Does anyone have a security plan in place?
What happens is that in an event that involves an active shooter, the command of that event is in the hands of the police, because we're not going to put crews in until the police says the site is secure. The police is very binary. The police says secure, not secure. And from their viewpoint, secure is we've fixed everything, right? From the viewpoint of healthcare, we're thinking, we'll go in to whatever area you say is safe. Maybe we can get people out of there. And we're more gradual that way. Where this comes to the fore even more than in the field is the code silver in hospitals. because more and more hospitals are thinking about what happens if we get an active shooter, because this has happened, right? And training with the police, I think it's Peel that just did a recent exercise. We realize that from the police viewpoint, until they've secured the whole hospital, they're not going to tell us it's good. They don't want anybody to come in. But from our viewpoint, we have to we're working on getting the message across to them that secure an area, clear it for us, we'll go and take out the patients. We won't go beyond that. We'll work with you. But that communication is still not totally smooth. But we're working on that part of it. But in that kind of an event, the site control, the incident commander is going to be the police, and we will have to take a second row to that. In the States, some of the EMS crews were trained to recognize what's called a forward body line, which means that if you walk to a scene and everybody from that point on is all lying down dead or symptomatic, you don't cross that line because there is something contaminating that area and they will back off. So that's in terms of a malicious event or a contaminated event. That's the only true, very specific EMS training I'm aware of. But the other part is you really have to work with your police, in field and in hospital. Other questions? Yeah?
In your experience, what are the psychosocial resources of disaster plans? I was the former director of social work at Foothills. We did that disaster plan. And one of the problems always was medical versus psychosocial.
Absolutely.
Trauma cases, I was on call the night of the, I've heard that we had a Pine Lake disaster, a tornado. And we had people coming in, but what happened is families followed, so we were...
Yeah, so that's a very good question. It opens a whole number of issues. It opens the family stress issue. It opens the family reunification issue, because you can't always reunify them. It opens the issue of post-event psychiatric and mental health issues. There are social workers in the hospitals, and the ones I've spoken to all seem to be attuned to the concept, but they're not there in numbers. There's no plan that I'm aware of that is specifically for the psychosocial support of the event. What they do have, most hospitals in their plan will think of some sort of intake center for non-patients. So when the family arrives, don't take them to the treatment area. Take them to a family area where there is someone who can find out what the status of their loved one is, and give them information, because that's the first thing they want. If they know that their loved one is okay in the operating room, whatever, that'll buy you some time, because at least they know where they're at, and then eventually marry them together. I mentioned earlier about the 4 triage areas where we send the patients, and I mentioned that there's actually 4.5. The half is what's called the gray zone. And the gray zone is for palliative patients who you know are not going to survive. And for those people, if you can, what you want to do is set aside an area where you can give them palliation, give them pain control if they need it, and let them be with their families. So that's the other part of that. But I'm not aware of any specific psychosocial components. Different hospitals involve their social workers in different ways. But that is a huge issue, you're absolutely right. And the other part of it is the pediatric issue, because how do you protect children who you may have had to forcibly separate because of decontamination, because of the parental illness, and how do you bring them back together? And how do you bring them back together to the correct person, right? There is, and every time you think people, you'll never hear something more depraved, you find more things. There are disaster groupies in the States who will follow events and will show up and present themselves volunteering to be counselors. They're not counselors, but they're trying to get in on the event. And to the point that now American hospitals will not allow people to come in unless they have some kind of accreditation that's been verified. So yeah, so that's the flip side. That's the dark side of your question. Other questions?
Well, that's a fantastic set of questions. I'd like to call upon...
Can I just ask one?
Oh, one more. Last one. Yeah, go, Marco.
You had a slide earlier that talked about all of the different agencies that can be involved in a disaster. And that included police, the EMS.
Yeah.
Then you had, on the other hand, on the right-hand side of the screen, people that we wouldn't have ordinarily have thought of, which included politicians, and included a whole bunch of other individuals. So the question that I have is, maybe it's a twofold question, but whose responsibility is it to create the type of dynamic disaster plan that clearly is required, has been contemplated by the medical profession, but seems not to have been adopted by anybody else? And has anybody thought in Canada of the liability? Okay, using the word liability, you guess I'm a lawyer. I don't do medical malpractice, so you're all safe. But has anybody thought of the liabilities involved? You've used terminology like standard of care, and you said that in a disaster scenario, there isn't. In my mind, that creates a legal liability.
You're absolutely right.
So how do we now, I'm going to put the big question out there because it's sort of like the little elephant that's been sitting there. Whose responsibility is it? And how do we create the scenario to give you the ability to do this across Canada, unified disaster preparedness?
So I've been banging my head against the wall long enough on these issues that I've developed frontal bossing, right? It's absolutely a really good question. There's a lawyer in Hamilton whose name now totally escapes me, but we will occasionally tag team because they want both of us to present about exactly that. And his message is always the same. If you do not prepare and show that you've done your due diligence, you are liable. If you prepare and unfortunately could not deliver because of the nature of the event, then you are protected. Right? So you're absolutely right. You can degrade care if you can show why you did it. Right? You can do certain things certain ways if you can show why you did it. But to do that, you have to have a plan. Now, who's responsible for the plan? A few years ago, I met with the Minister of Public Safety at the time. He's a previous minister who will remain nameless. It was myself and the president-elect of the Canadian Association of Emergency Physicians, and we sat down with him because we recognized that the healthcare world understands health, the disaster world understands disaster. Neither of them understand the other side of this coin. So we sat down with him, and his response was telling. His response was, well, I would just turf this to the Minister of Health, and then he started to talk about hockey. It was one of the most frustrating events of my life, I have to tell you. He really didn't want to touch the subject. So in my mind, ultimately, the responsibility is federal. Ultimately. The problem is we have a federal-provincial divide. So we have the Public Health Agency of Canada, who is trying very hard to do really good work, and there are some people there who have as much frontal bossing as I do. Right? So a few years ago, we wrote a textbook. The group of people, the Centre of Excellence in Emergency Preparedness, we brought in the best of the best expertise, 500-page door-stopper tome of a book, everything soup to nuts on how to prepare a facility for disasters. It's peer-reviewed, it stands up, and it's been reviewed externally, and it stands up to scrutiny. We gave that to the federal government. The federal government, and I have 6 months of correspondence, could not take it because they were not allowed to give it to the provinces. That the pushback would be terrible. So we have a problem here in terms of how we structured healthcare. And this is way beyond my pay grade. But that's why I can't tell you who's responsible. Ultimately, I would think that since disaster response is always local, I would think it behooves the hospital to do its own, prepare its own Shabbat and do its own thing. Because if you wait for someone else to do it for you, it's not going to happen. And by the way, that book was picked up by the Chinese. The People's Medical Publishing House came to us and said, we want that book because they recognize they're very centralized and they wanted to make it uniform throughout the country.
Well, leaving aside the issue of provincial versus federal jurisdiction, that's controlled by the Canada Act. Mm-hmm. And there is a crossover between federal responsibility and provincial. But let's just look at it then. As I take it from the 30,000-foot view down, that's federal. But I'm also cognizant of what you're talking about as being local. We know that the province is responsible for healthcare within each of the provinces. So maybe the place to start is for me to ask who in the province is responsible, and has each of the medical associations within the province or the colleges gone to the provinces and said, you need to have a disaster plan, province A. Forget about anything that's beyond the borders of your particular province, but you have to have a disaster plan.
All right. So my answer to that would ultimately be the Minister of Health, because the address is different from province to province. Structures are different. When pandemic was upon us, thankfully it was not a terrible event, but when it was upon us, we sent out from CAPE, the Emergency Physicians Association, and from my centre, we contacted all the provincial ministers of health, and we said, in a totally non-judgmental fashion, we have resources. We are happy if you want them, just tell us. We will deploy. We will come to wherever you want us to go. Right? We didn't ask them for honoraria. Our expectation was we would have had expenses covered. We never even asked for that. We got almost clone letters from every Minister of Health saying, thank you very much, but we're ready. Because from 30,000 feet, it looks great. Once you're at the coalface, it looks very different. So the problem is, I don't think that either they're not convinced, and this is supposition, I can't prove this, either they're not convinced, or they know there's a problem, which is why they're not asking, because they don't want to find out officially, because if they find out, they've got to do something about it. But I would lay it at the door of the Minister of Health of every province, because ultimately that's who's responsible, and they have the resources. Okay.
Great. Call on Dr. Jim Cohen, also a Calgary friend of MDA, for closing comments and thank yous.
Oh, I'll step down.
Wonderful to meet you, Dr. Kolick, and had an opportunity to chat with him before the talk, and I
did learn about his experience as a teenager with MDA, just to show the relationship between that talk and how fundamental it can be for young people to get involved and can be career building. The other thing I learned was that his hobby is improv. And in the preparation of disaster planning, when his computer didn't work, that that hobby came in handy. You handled it brilliantly, so that's what it was most wonderful. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Kolick, for the huge effort you made in coming to Calgary and preparing such an interesting and thought-provoking presentation. The work of emergency physicians and first responders requires years of training, dedication, and self-sacrifice. The legacy of your altruistic, life-saving service is remembered and revered by those unfortunate souls who acquire the administration of your talents. Thank you so much again for sharing your experience and knowledge with us. This has been a most enlightening talk and discussion. I'd like to thank Dr. Eddie Lang for sowing the seed of this presentation over a year ago and helping us so much in bringing it to fruition. I'd like to acknowledge the critical role that you played in the program. Without your help, this would never have happened. I'd like to thank the University of Calgary in co-sponsoring this event, along with Beth Tzedec and the Calgary branch of MDA. We greatly appreciate the assistance and the outreach of the university. I'd like to thank the rabbi and staff of the Beth Tzedec for allowing MDA to share with the Tzed Talk organized by Dr. Lang and the synagogue. Your generosity of thought and spirit in allowing MDA to share in the sponsorship is of great help to the Calgary chapter. Lastly, I would like to recognize Nava and Sam Wayner in their many long years of leadership and dedication, not only in initiating the local chapter of MDA in Calgary, but for their ongoing efforts that have culminated in raising necessary funds needed for the stuff that's required in disaster planning, and to continue its life-saving service in Israel and overseas. Toby Friedman and Nava Wayner, active members of the Calgary Friends of MDA, have assembled a household emergency action bag that pertains to someone's question about what you can do for emergency planning, and they will distribute it to all as you leave the auditorium. Thank you all for coming and participating in the event.